Are you picking this up? Is anyone there? Ah, there you are. Welcome to Battles Made Easy's first broadcast. I'm your host Paul, and our goal is to provide an easy way for anyone to understand battles throughout history. Today we kick off the channel with our first series of battles on this day in history. Today we're looking at the first day of one of the bloodiest battles of the First World War. 7:30 a.m. on the 1st of July 1916, you and your pals all signed up to fight together in the British Army. Now you stand in your trenches ready to go over the top. You're told all preparations for the coming attack are complete, and with one final mighty artillery barrage finishing, you're told the enemy must be destroyed. Command is given and the whistles sound. You all pile over the top into the morning sunshine, and what you find is not what you expected. You're met with the rattle of machine gun fire, the enemy artillery firing back at you, shell craters and the masses of deadly barbed wire. Your friends are falling down. You might be next. This is the first day of the Battle of the Somme. To find out why the battle was unfolding this way, we need to rewind time a little bit. Just before we do that, let's clear up which armies were fighting here and who was leading them on that day. Troops from the German Empire were the only troops of the Central Powers fighting at the Somme. The Central Powers at this time consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire, with General Fritz von Bülow in command of the German troops on the first day. On the side of the Allies were the United Kingdom and forces across the British Empire, with General Sir Douglas Haig in overall command of the British troops and Lieutenant General Lawrenson in command of the fighting troops during the first day of the Somme. Fighting alongside Britain was France, with General Joseph Joffre in overall command of the French forces and General Ferdinand Foch commanding troops on the day. Countries in the Allies at this time were Britain, France, Russia, Italy and Japan. Of course, you had all the individual commanders commanding their infantry divisions and the commanders in the field below them. The war had been a bloody stalemate since the opposing sides started practicing trench warfare during the end of 1914 and into the start of 1915. The Allies believed that this could be ended with one big offensive from all the Allies in Europe at the same time. The French suggested in July of 1915 that an offensive of this nature should take place. Britain wanted the attack to be in and around Belgium and northwestern France, but that's where its main theatre operations were at the time. However, the French wanted the offensive to take place where their two armies met on the front line, so General Haig agreed in early February 1916 to an attack around the Somme River. The French planned to be much more involved in the battle, but the German attack on Verdun on the 26th of February 1916 required substantial numbers of men, so Britain's army became the primary fighting force, and this was the first time that the British Expeditionary Force, BEF for short, which is the name given to Britain's army at this time, would take the lead in an offensive in the war. And also it has to be said here that because the French were originally taking the lead, initial plans for the battle were laid out by General Joffre, so some of the responsibility for the outcome does also belong to him. In addition, the British are the predominant force battling on this day, so the episode will be primarily focused on them. The attack itself will take place across a section of roughly 25-mile front line, both north and south of the River Somme, Beaumont-Hamel being the furthest point north, and the town of Le Hans being the furthest point south. The attack would take place. The centre of the attack would be coming from near the front line around Carnoy and Maricourt. This area of the front line had been nicknamed the Quiet Front by the French before they handed it to the British in preparation for the attack in August 1915, and they hadn't really done anything to reinforce the position since the war had reduced to trench warfare. The Germans, on the other hand, had been very busy building and digging new defences without any interference from the French. The ground was hard, dry, and chalky soil was perfect for digging trenches and dugouts, which they did. They dug them deep underground, which made them almost immune to artillery fire. Additionally, they had buried telephone cables very deep and communication trenches just as deep to help alert reserves to any coming assault. Arguably, most importantly, they had strategically placed machine gun nests across the front line to cover every possible angle of attack, which themselves were protected by dense barbed wire. It was clear to Haig and the British when they took control of this sector, before any assault could be launched, some serious improvements to infrastructure would be needed. The area behind the lines, the town of Alba, which is about 3 miles back, and the bigger city of Amiens, about 80 miles even further back than that, were made into a massive military compound, with new roads created to and from the front lines capable of taking all the artillery shells and equipment that would be needed for the upcoming battle. The British created artillery positions, storage for the shells needed for them, and encampments that would act as staging areas for the upcoming attack. Now, for the men taking part in this battle, they were primarily from the United Kingdom. However, troops from around the British Empire were also present, from Newfoundland, Bermuda, New Zealand and Canada, to name a few. There were 17 divisions available for the offensive, which 13 were going to be used. The majority of these men, being brand new to war, having answered the call, volunteering to fight. One of the most famous War I posters is that of Lord Kitchener pointing and saying, "Your country needs you." Some of these divisions were made up of the Pals and Chums battalions. This is where friends and family signed up to train and fight together. But jumping forward a little bit, when these men saw action at the Somme, the impact of their communities at home was tremendous, as within a day, thousands of men from the same town or city would die. After conscription was introduced in 1916, the Pals and Chums battalions were avoided in future. Now to round off, there were 6 German divisions defending the British sector on the Somme. So, what was Haig's plan for the first day of battle? Simply put, he wanted the main attack to be made by the British 4th Army down the middle of the line, with the British 3rd Army in the north and the French 6th Army in the south making attacks to divert away from the main thrust. All this was supported by a week-long artillery bombardment. The goal of the artillery was to smash any defences the Germans had made, take out any machine gun nests they had, and cutting any barbed wire they had placed. To ensure this was done, nearly 3 million artillery shells had been made available. Now, how were they to deliver this massive payload? Well, they had around 1,000 field guns, 180 heavy guns, and 245 heavy howitzers. The French had themselves around 900 heavy guns for their part in battle. What exactly are the differences between these types of artillery available, I hear you cry? Well, let's go and have a little look. A field gun is usually a more mobile artillery piece, so in theory can be relocated to basically wherever it's needed. An example of one of these would be a British QF 18-pounder. Heavy guns were fixed in place and were able to move, but could fire larger shells over longer distances, better suited for bombarding trenches, an example of which would be the French Canon de Schneider. A heavy howitzer is an extremely powerful piece of artillery. As with a heavy gun, it's fixed in place, but is better suited to hitting fixed targets such as towns or large structures. The variety used in the First World War used anywhere between 90mm shells to a massive 420mm shell. Examples of these would be the British BL 9.2-inch or the more well-known German-made gun Big Bertha. Over the 7-day bombardment of 3 million shells available, it's estimated that 1.5 million were fired. By doing some quick maths, that's around 214,285 shells fired per day. 9,000 shells every hour, 148 shells a minute. On the face of it, you can see why Haig was so optimistic about how effective the bombardment would be. But as we delve a little bit deeper, we can understand why its impact could be overestimated. Before a shell was fired, there were issues. Many of the men manning the guns were, like the soldiers going over the top, inexperienced, making it difficult for some of the more complex operations of firing artillery to be carried out efficiently. When the shells were fired, it's estimated around 30% of them did not explode, making them useless. Additionally, many shells that were fired were shrapnel shells, great against soft targets like infantry, not so good against trenches or concrete dugouts. The bombardment was nearing its end, with the 1st of July kickoff date fast approaching. Now 6:25 on the 1st of July, with the start time set for 7:30, the Allies laid down one final massive artillery barrage before sending the men over the top. 250,000 shells were fired, and it was so powerful it could be heard just north of London. Compare that to the 9,000 the day previous, this barrage was 27 times more powerful than those previous barrages. At 7:20, the first of 8 huge mines were exploded in the German lines. They were placed in strategic positions in the months and weeks leading up to the battle by British Royal Engineers, by digging tunnels underground under no man's land. This first mine exploded at Hawthorne Ridge with 40,000 pounds of high explosive. A witness, and also the man who recorded the explosion, was official war cameraman Lieutenant Geoffrey Malins. This is what he had to say about the explosion. The ground where I stood gave a mighty convulsion. It rocked and swayed. I gripped hold of my tripod to steady myself. The earth rose high into the air, to a height of hundreds of feet. Higher and higher it rose, and with a horrible grinding roar, the earth settled back upon itself. At 7:30, the trench whistle sounded, and the order was given to go over the top. The men made their way out of the trenches and into no man's land. They would have struggled to manoeuvre or move quickly under the 60 pounds of gear they were holding onto that they thought would be needed to reinforce the presumably empty enemy trenches. As they advanced, the men were deafened by artillery, had limited visibility, and almost choked due to the dust clouds caused by shells. They found themselves unable to keep up with the artillery being fired to cover them. As the enemy positions were in view, they were met with the rattle of machine gun fire, the crack of rifle fire, then hit with the enemy's counter-artillery. Men were being killed in the hundreds. Many men wouldn't even make it a few yards into no man's land. Lieutenant Alfred Bundy, who went over the top with his men, had this to say. Suddenly, an appalling rifle and machine gun fire opened up against us, and my men commenced to fall. I shouted down, but most of those who were still not hit had already taken cover. I dropped in a shell hole and occasionally attempted to move my head to the left or the right. The bullets were forming an impenetrable barrage, and exposure of the head meant certain death. None of our men was visible, but in all directions came pitiful groans and cries of pain. Barbed wire, instead of being cut by the bombardment, formed into bigger, more deadly masses. Men were either caught up in it, or if they did find a gap, it was full of other men trying to get through, making them easy targets either way. This was not what had been expected. It seems the enemy's defences were, for the most part, still intact, with the effectiveness of the artillery being overestimated. By 8:30, 66,000 British men had gone over the top, with just under half of them now casualties. That's just over 8 per second since 7:30. If you were one of the many men wounded in No Man's Land, then you're either able to return to the British lines, either by yourself or with help from one of your comrades, or you were left to lie in No Man's Land, either awaiting rescue or to die. One account of the day by Private Bert Payne recorded that he shot a fellow British soldier on his way back, almost blown to pieces, but was somehow still alive, grasping for air, sobbing and calling out for someone called Annie. If you did manage to get back to the lines, then you were still at risk from German artillery or mortar fire. For the men who did make it through No Man's Land, they would find themselves trapped in a tangled system of broken trenches, being shelled and shot at without hope of reinforcement, with many men forced back from those hard-won positions back over No Man's Land by German counterattacks. For most men going over the top, this is what they faced this day. There were some successes, however, with the French in the south taking all assigned objectives. However, at the end of the day, of the 100,000 or 220,000, depending on the source, British who went over the top, 57,470 were casualties, made up of 19,240 killed or died of their wounds, 35,494 wounded, 2,152 missing, and 585 taken prisoner. French took 1,590 casualties, and the Germans somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000, depending on the source you read. It was the greatest loss in British military history, with roughly 3% of Britain's casualties for the entire war taking place on this one day. The end result of this loss of life was the gain of around 3 square miles of territory. And one quote from Private J.F. Pout of the 55th Field Ambulance sums up the carnage of the day. If the British public could have seen the wounded struggling to get out of the line, the war would have possibly been stopped by public opinion. Not until the 6th of July did High Command know of the losses and the scale and number of casualties. It was not militarily possible to call off the offensive. They had to consider the French now fighting in the 4-month-old Battle of the Somme, with the Somme helping to relieve pressure there, and the Russians and Italians mounting simultaneous assaults in their own fronts alongside the Somme offensive. The battle raged on for 4.5 months until bad weather led General Haig to shut down the offensive on the 18th of November. The end of battle number of casualties on all sides stood at around 1.22 million. 419,655 British casualties, 194,451 French, and the Germans suffered between 450,000 and 600,000 killed or wounded, depending on the source. German losses were recorded every 10 days, rather than each day like the British, making it more difficult to get an exact figure. Before going into the aftermath and the lessons learnt of the battle, a word must be said about General Haig. In the years after the Great War, his reputation suffered badly, known by many still today as the Butcher of the Somme, with him taking the blame for the casualties and death on the day. However, in more recent times, historians tend to attribute the extreme casualty rate on the nature of trench warfare itself, alongside the failings of the British Army at the time, rather than on individual commanders. We could do an entire episode dedicated to Haig, but I'll just say this. He was always a divisive character, during and after the war, but perhaps, however, not all the blame can be put solely on his shoulders. Now, let's move on to the aftermath. There were many failings by the British on the first day of the Somme, failings regarding the artillery being arguably the most crucial in the outcome. A relatively low number of artillery guns were stretched across almost 20 miles of British front line, preventing any sort of concentrated fire. As we have seen, there was a huge number of shells fired, but when you think of the number of shells that did not explode or the wrong type, combined with the thin spread across the front, you can see why this did not have the impact Haig and High Command expected, leaving many strong points and machine gun posts almost untouched. Add to this the inexperience of the men manning the artillery and the inflexible tactics used on the day, with the artillery unable to react to the actual situation on the ground. Again, you can see why the first day did not go as planned for the British. In the past, the Somme has had the reputation of describing the futility of the entire war. Despite how true that might seem from the surface, there were many reactions and tactical developments following and during the Somme offensive. Germany, shocked by the massive use of artillery and believing they were losing the battle of material, reacted to the Somme assault by increasing arms production. In addition, Germany as well as Britain suffered a high number of casualties, and this led to the eventual strategic withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line defences in March 1917, instead of battling in the same trenches they had done previously. The failings of the first day of the Somme would lead to improvements in the British Army. Artillery tactics would improve, using better shells for cutting barbed wire and coordinating barrages with the movement of attacking infantry, and using aerial reconnaissance to target the enemy artillery before it could fire back. And in 1918, the British would be utilising everything they had learned to surprise the Germans with a shorter, massive concentration of artillery fire to properly take out the defences. And not only were artillery tactics improved, infantry units were better organised, becoming more mobile, capable of performing quick thrusts supported by offensive machine gun fire. The Somme would also see the first use of a tank in support of an infantry attack. It had limited success, but it was a sign of the future to come. The Somme is one of the bloodiest battles in history, and it will always be remembered for the losses on its first day and overall. But out of all that bloodshed, a professional British army would develop. Far from the pals and chums who would never know more, they would be a formidable fighting force that would go on to win decisive battles in the war. Finally, I have this to say. This episode has only scratched the surface of what is available on the Somme. Now check out the reading list I've put together, and perhaps you can find something out that you didn't know before, or that we haven't included here. For more Battles Made Easy, make sure you subscribe to stay up to date with our latest releases. And as always, our source list is available in the description. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.